So today I'm going to tell you the best 3 stories that I know. I think these stories are absolutely phenomenally potent, and the reason for that is that I think they illustrate in an extraordinarily powerful way the nature of the processes that led to the establishment of Western democratic ideals. Mircea Eliade, whose work I rely on substantially to make the following argument, has taken Western academic culture to task in a manner that hasn't fully been revealed yet. He said that, like all human cultures, the West is parochial and narrow in its viewpoint. And although over the last 300 years there's been a substantial amount of cross-cultural intermingling and a potential broadening of philosophical and religious horizon, that broadening has not been sufficiently complete. If we build on the viewpoint that I've been developing with you over the last few courses and make the presupposition that religious modes of thinking are more phenomenological than they are rational, which means that they deal more with what you experience, say, than with the objective world. If we look at archaic religious stories through that lens, then they can start to open up. And so, given that, I want to open up 3 religious stories to you today. 2 in-depth and 1 only in passing, because we'll return to it later. I'll start with the Judeo-Christian myth of Genesis. When I say myth, I don't mean untruth. I mean a form of knowledge that's narrative in structure and predicated on presumptions that aren't empirical. A myth describes processes of transformation. A myth describes the process whereby elements of experience come into being and transform. The fundamental structural elements of Genesis are the Word of God and chaos. And the Hebrew words for chaos and waste are teom for chaos and tohu for waste. And teom in particular, although tohu as well, are very interesting words because you can track their derivation historically. And sometimes if you can track the derivation of words historically, you can get some sense of the cultural milieu out of which the words sprang. And we know what Tiamat means because we have written records of a story that involves a character named Tiamat. And Tiamat is a dragon who lives at the bottom of the ocean. In the oldest creation myth we have, which is the Enuma Elish, the Sumerian creation myth. Sumeria, Babylon, Acadia, rightly regarded as the birthplace of modern Western civilization. In Genesis, 2 processes unite to produce being. The first of those processes or states is chaos, represented by teom or tohu. The second of those processes is logos. And logos is another word that has an extraordinarily broad range of meaning. It's generally transcribed in the Christian tradition as the Word, and it's identified with Christ, which is a very peculiar identification because it's the Word of God that creates order out of chaos. And of course, the Word of God in Genesis is a phenomena that predates the birth of Christ infinitely from a classical religious perspective. So the fact that the 2 beings are identified is of great peculiarity and also of great interest. The fundamental story of Genesis is something like this, and it's perhaps the most brilliant contribution of Judeo-Christian thought to world history. Its total impact is virtually incalculable. The idea is this, that chaos can be conceptualized as something that has an essentially feminine aspect, as a matrix. And a matrix is a structure from which other structures emerge. And the story in Genesis makes the hypothesis that logos, which is the Word of God, a phenomena associated with speech and communication and logic, logos, logic, rationality, courage, exploration, all combined into a single entity or trait, logos. The combination of logos and chaos is what brings order into being. That's what the story in Genesis means. It's not an empirical description of the origin of objects. It's a phenomenological description of the origin of experience. The idea being that without the piercing glance of whatever consciousness is, whatever the background of experience is, the matrix, chaos, cannot be conceptualized as real. It takes the interplay between the feminine principle, chaos, and the masculine principle, logos, in order to produce being. Now, that's of substantial importance when you give some consideration to the fact that immediately in Genesis, after the establishment of livable order, the deity Yahweh identifies the individual human being with logos, right? Made in God's image. That's the essential characteristic of the human being. And what that means is that the logos that operates in human beings, which is this capacity to make order out of chaos, is identical to the principle that gives rise to the cosmos from a mythological perspective. So it partakes of the deity in a very direct sense, insofar as being itself is dependent on its operation. Now, it's still possible to claim, given that perspective, that a story with that sort of structure is superstitious, and that it doesn't bear any relationship to what actually constitutes reality. But you have to understand that that story, old as it is predicated on older stories, and it's on the ground that those older stories established that our entire concept of natural rights rests. So if you believe that natural rights have an existence that's more than merely arbitrary, the reason you believe that is because those rights are predicated on the ideas that are expressed in these myths. Okay, so now we're going to go back in time to Sumeria, and I'm going to show you how the Sumerian creation myth lays itself out. And not only that, I'm going to describe to you the direct political implications of the Enuma Elish, the Sumerian creation myth, because the political implications of that myth are well understood, because the political structure of Sumeria was directly associated with the structure of the myth, because the Sumerian emperor was regarded as the earthly representative of the highest god in the Mesopotamian pantheon, whose name was Marduk. So insofar as you were emperor, the reason that you were emperor, and this is what gave your sovereignty legitimacy, right? Because sovereignty has to have legitimacy, otherwise there's constant revolutions. What gave sovereignty legitimacy in Mesopotamia was the identification of the emperor with Marduk. And that had certain implications for the emperor, which we'll discuss in some detail. The story starts like this. You've got this dragon, Tiamat. And Tiamat is a great primordial beast who lives at the bottom of the ocean. And the ocean is water, and water is associated with the primal element in archaic thinking. And I told you, there's reasons for that already. If you viewed the transformation of deserts as a consequence of rain, you can understand why water would be considered the element that gives life, right? The element that brings life forth. And we know from an evolutionary perspective that that's accurate, and we know that we're 90% water. And so to consider water the primal element is no trivial conclusion, no less than presuming that the sun is the ultimate source of life, the ultimate God, because the sun is the ultimate source of life as far as we're concerned on Earth, right? Because it's the source of all our energy. These aren't stupid concepts, all right? So Tiamat is this horrible creature that lurks at the bottom of the primal element, all right? Now she has a husband, Apsu. Now the Mesopotamian creation myth doesn't say much about Apsu. We only know that he's the male consort of the dragon of chaos. And we know from reading other sources of mythology that the male consort of the dragon of chaos generally represents either logos or culture. So we're going to make the presupposition in this particular case that the husband of chaos is order or culture. Okay, and then the Mesopotamians don't say much about that. That doesn't, the development of the idea of Apsu or order or culture doesn't take new force